The night started off quietly until flashing patrol lights stopped a black sedan on an empty road. The officers thought they already knew who they were dealing with, or so they believed. One coded lock, one alarm, and everything spiraled out of control. What happened next turned their world upside down. Michael Walker was cruising down an empty highway in his sleek black sedan, the hum of the engine and the stillness of the night his only companions. At 42, Michael was the epitome of composure, a disciplined man who had spent his life respecting the rules and expecting the same in return. But like many black men in America, he knew that sometimes the rules played against him. Just as he began to relax, red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp blare of a siren. Michael's heart sank, but his face remained neutral. He slowly pulled over, turned on his hazard lights, and took a deep breath. His hands moved to the steering wheel, a practiced gesture meant to keep things calm. He wasn't taking any chances. Two officers exited the squad car, their boots crunching against the gravel. Sergeant Dan Randall, stocky with a permanent scowl, approached the driver's side. His partner, Officer Carl Bates, lanky but with a cocky air, lingered near the rear bumper, sizing up the car as if it were stolen. Dan leaned into the open window, his expression oozing skepticism. "Evening," he said, his tone flat, but sharp enough to cut glass. Michael nodded. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was steady, but his pulse quickened. Dan smirked, tilting his head. "Oh, there's definitely a problem. This car looks a little too nice for you. Mind telling me where you're headed?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed. "I'm heading home. Everything's in order if you need to check." Carl chimed in from behind the car, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Dan, doesn't he look like that guy from the bulletin? You know, tall, dark, and suspicious?" Dan snorted. "Yes, same profile." His eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about a theft reported nearby, would you?" Michael inhaled deeply, his grip on the wheel firm but calm. "No, officer, I've done nothing wrong. Your suspicions are misplaced." Dan's smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Misplaced, huh? Listen, buddy, we'll decide what's what. Step out of the car." Michael hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out. The cool night air hit him as he stood next to the car, his hands at his sides. He was met with an aggressive shove as Dan forced him to face the car's hood. "Spread your arms," Dan barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Michael's voice remained steady, but the frustration began to seep through. "This is unnecessary. I've done nothing wrong." Carl snorted as he patted down Michael's jacket. "Unnecessary? Funny, that's exactly what a guilty guy would say." Dan chuckled darkly. "You got something to hide, don't you? Maybe something in that fancy trunk of yours?" Michael turned his head slightly, meeting Dan's gaze with quiet defiance. "I have nothing to hide. What you're doing is harassment." Dan's face twisted in mock offense. "Harassment? Nah, this is called keeping the streets safe from guys like you." Carl moved toward the trunk, grinning. "Let's see what Mr. Innocent here is packing." Michael clenched his fist but stayed calm. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of rattling him. "You don't have a warrant. You can't search my vehicle." Dan's laugh was cold. "Warrant? Let me explain something. Out here, we're the law. Now stand still." As Carl began fiddling with the trunk, Michael felt his patience wearing thin. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back, but he knew better. He had to play the long game. The situation was spiraling, and Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. These men weren't just looking for trouble. They were determined to find it, even if it didn't exist. And Michael? He was determined to make it through the night, no matter what it took. Michael stood by his car, his composure stretched thin but unbroken. He watched as the two officers loomed over him, their faces alight with a mix of arrogance and malice. It was clear they had no intention of keeping this professional. Dan leaned in close, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's see what you're hiding, big shot." He grabbed Michael's arm roughly, twisting it back with unnecessary force. Michael winced but didn't flinch. "I've told you already, there's nothing to hide. Your actions are unlawful." Dan chuckled, ignoring him entirely. Unlawful? That's rich. Around here, the law's what I say it is. Carl, meanwhile, rummaged through the car's interior, yanking open the glove compartment and patting down the seats. Oh, come on, Dan. Guys like him always have something squirreled away. Let's see if our friend here has a secret stash. Michael's jaw tightened, but his tone remained steady. You're not going to find anything because there's nothing to find. Carl smirked, tossing a stray napkin onto the ground as he moved toward the trunk. You sure about that, buddy? 'Cause I'm betting there's more to this shiny ride than meets the eye. Michael's patience was wearing thin, but he held his ground. This is harassment, plain and simple. You have no right. Before he could finish, Dan yanked his other arm, forcing him to lean harder against the hood of the car. Look, tough guy, we're not interested in your lectures. Save it for someone who cares. Carl popped the trunk and let out an exaggerated whistle. Well, what do we have here? He pulled out a sleek black briefcase, the kind that practically screamed important. Michael's voice sharpened. Don't touch that. Those are confidential documents. Dan laughed loudly, his grip on Michael tightening. Confidential? You're hilarious, man. What are you, a secret agent or something? Carl inspected the briefcase, noting the coded lock. Oh, this is fancy. Bet there's something juicy in here. Want to crack it open, Dan? Michael's tone turned icy. You don't have the authority to do this. That briefcase is protected. Dan waved him off, crouching down next to Carl. Authority, schmoothority. I'm feeling pretty authorized right now. Carl started fiddling with the lock, his fingers working with a mix of eagerness and impatience. Michael clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling just under the surface. A sharp *click* broke the tense silence as the lock gave way. As soon as Carl opened the briefcase, a loud, piercing alarm sounded, cutting through the night like a siren. Both officers froze, their smug grins fading into confusion. Dan blinked, his face briefly betraying a hint of concern. What the heck was that? Carl hesitated, then waved it off. Probably just a scare tactic. Let's see what's inside. They rifled through the papers, their initial bravado returning as they pulled out file after file. Looks like a bunch of boring reports, Dan muttered, flipping through the documents. But Carl's face suddenly went pale. He pointed to one of the pages, his hand trembling slightly. Dan, look at this. Dan squinted, his brow furrowing as he read. His expression shifted from annoyance to outright disbelief. Wait, is that? No, that can't be right. Carl's voice was barely above a whisper. It's got our names on it, Dan. What is this? The two exchanged a panicked glance, their bravado now completely gone. Michael, still pinned against the car, couldn't help but notice the growing unease in their voices. Something wrong, officers? He asked, his tone calm but cutting. Neither of them answered, their focus entirely on the incriminating pages in their hands. The tension hung thick in the air, and for the first time that night, Michael felt the scales beginning to shift. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dan and Carl stood frozen, staring at the incriminating documents in their hands, their earlier bravado replaced by visible panic. Michael, still restrained against the car, could see the cracks forming in their confidence. And then, as if on cue, the low rumble of engines broke the silence. Two sleek black SUVs pulled up to the scene, their tinted windows reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. The doors swung open and out stepped a team of federal agents in dark suits, their movements swift and purposeful. The lead agent, a tall man with a commanding presence, wasted no time. "Drop your weapons! Hands where we can see them!" he barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. Dan and Carl instinctively stepped back, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. "Whoa, what's going on here?" Dan stammered, raising his hands defensively. "On your knees now," the lead agent snapped, motioning for his team to secure the scene. Within seconds, the two officers were disarmed and in handcuffs, their earlier dominance now reduced to helpless compliance. Meanwhile, another agent approached Michael, who was still leaning against the car. "Sir, are you okay?" the agent asked, quickly removing the cuffs from Michael's wrists. Michael straightened, dusting off his jacket with deliberate care. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos around him. "I'm fine now, thanks to you," he said, his voice steady. Dan, still kneeling on the ground, tried to protest. "Hey, this is a misunderstanding. We were just doing our job." His voice cracked with desperation. Michael turned to face the two officers, his expression unreadable. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, and locked eyes with Dan. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the distant chirp of crickets. "You have no idea who you've been messing with," Michael began, his tone sharp and cutting. "My name is Michael Walker, and I'm the Attorney General of this state." Dan and Carl's faces went pale as the weight of those words sank in. They exchanged panicked glances, realizing just how badly they had miscalculated. Michael continued, his voice steady, but laced with controlled anger. "The documents you so eagerly tried to tamper with, they contain evidence of misconduct, corruption, and systematic abuse in your department. Evidence that I was personally delivering to the court." Carl's jaw dropped. "Wait, what? No, this can't be—" Michael cut him off, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "Oh, it is. And the irony? You've just handed me even more proof of your blatant abuse of power. Congratulations. You've made my case airtight." The federal agents began escorting the two officers toward the SUVs, their protests falling on deaf ears. "You can't do this. We didn't know," Dan shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. Michael shook his head, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "Ignorance isn't a defense, not when people like you make a mockery of the badge you wear." As the SUVs pulled away, the scene began to clear. But the story was far from over. News of the incident spread like wildfire, capturing headlines across the nation. Footage from nearby surveillance cameras and eyewitness accounts painted a damning picture of Dan and Carl's actions that night. Michael Walker became a symbol of resilience and justice, his story inspiring thousands to stand up against injustice. Letters poured in from across the country thanking him for his courage and urging him to continue the fight. For Michael, the night had been a reminder of the battles still left to fight, but also a victory, one that would resonate far beyond the roadside where it all began. How would you have handled a situation like this if you were in Michael's place? Do you think he did the right thing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something similar? Let us know. We want to hear your stories. Don't forget to like and share this story to spread awareness. This story was created to shed light on important social issues and inspire positive change in the world. Your voice matters, and together we can make a difference.